Sweet. And we're live for episode 8 with Maria Jos, who is currently in the UAE. Maria grew up in Kerala and moved to Delhi to pursue her undergraduate studies at St. Stephen's College. She went on to earn a master's degree in economics from the University of Madras and the National University of Singapore. Maria worked with the World Bank across South Asia before pursuing an MBA at the Wharton School in Philadelphia, USA. She then joined McKinsey and Company in Dubai, where she advised clients across the Middle East, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, on business and strategy topics. More recently, she transitioned into the startup space, where she has been building. So, Maria, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
You've studied at some of the premium institutes in India and abroad, and the US and Singapore. What are the main differences you see in education between here and there?
I think the highlight of the Indian education system or the institutions that I was privileged to be part of has always been the people. Right? So the biggest differentiator with the Indian education system is often your classmates who are absolute powerhouses. And since it's such a selective process to get into most of the good Indian universities or schools, I think the level of intellect that you encounter in the classroom is always astounding. The biggest differentiator with colleges and schools abroad is the linkage to real life applications, right? So you see a lot more of, even if you're studying something like economics or business, the curriculum often connects you closer to what happens in real life, whether it's in business or in companies, and equips you actually more for real life, right, in some way. So I think this is kind of the big differentiation that I have personally observed between schools in India versus whether you look at Singapore or the US.
Right, I see. It's interesting that you mentioned St. Stephen's because my sister went there as well. Do you feel like the level of intellect is comparable between a place like St. Stephen's and Wharton? And this is just me asking out of personal curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a school like Wharton, for example, whether even if it's in the interview process or what you observe in the classroom, it's selecting for many different aspects, right? So you meet people who come from like different backgrounds, very different industry backgrounds and sectors, things like that. So they bring very unique and different perspectives. My experience, of course, in St. Stephen's was during the undergrads, right? So you had obviously a cutoff in terms of like the percentages that you had to score.
Yes.
Along with an interview process where they tested out what were your level of aspirations, ambitions, etc. Right, but it's also still sort of homogeneous in some way because all of us who are there are Indians. Versus if you go to a school in the US,
Yeah.
it has people coming from all parts of the world, right? So particularly like an MBA program at Wharton, they're very keen on getting that diversity of perspectives from different places.
I see. As a student, how did you usually manage finances? Was expense management something you thought of right from the beginning of being a student abroad, considering avenues of expenditure such as eating out and socializing?
I think I'd like to take this in two parts because my experience was very different when I went to, say, a National University of Singapore as an exchange student versus when I went to do my MBA at Wharton, by which time I had already worked for a few years before. So I think during the exchange period, the strategy was, minimize spend as much as you can, right? Because it's also before you've actually worked for long periods versus a school like Wharton, which is used to, every year has a high percentage of international students. It has a very structured system in place for helping you figure out the expenses during your MBA because it's a pretty hefty sum you spend on your tuition plus the expenditure, etc. So they already arranged a loan, which actually took into account also your living expenses, averaged out to say, if you had to live a middle of the path sort of lifestyle while at school, which took into consideration expenses, including for travel, right? Some of it. And so that sort of gave a structure for what was the amount you were working with. The worries were very different from when you were straight out of undergrad and going and pursuing a master's degree as an exchange student. Very different. So the school and the linkage to the loan and provisions linked to that kind of sort out the financial planning aspect in some way. Then you do an internship in after your first year of your MBA. So then you're also earning money while in the program in some sense. So all of those things also factor into how you think about spending. And again, because it was a loan and all of those things that were arranged through the school, that process was outsourced, right? And then you just had to work within those overall structures that you had.
So when you go to university in the States or in the UK, is this an understood thing that they help you with budgeting, especially if you're an international student?
No, I don't think this is that widely observed or prevalent. This is definitely something that exists within the top MBA programs in the US, because also there is a guarantee of employability, right? That the school feels they can provide because you're doing a degree that has high corporate application. So the possibility of you getting a job which can help you pay off that loan as per the schools and the bank's terms are, work out. But I don't think this is so common, let's say in the UK or even for other sets of programs you might go to in the US. From what I understand, this is something that's definitely exists for MBA programs, but not so sure how prevalent it is for other programs, right?
I see, I see. Because this is the first time I'm hearing of something like this. It's very interesting. It makes a lot of sense that they would help.
Yeah. A lot of the times, I wish it was also something that was more widely discussed. Obviously, the interest rates you pay for these loans are higher than what an American student would pay.
Of
But
course.
because the school is guaranteeing it and the payment or terms only start once you have finished your MBA, you sort of have the mind space to go for it without having to worry a lot about financing from term to term. Right? So I think it's a pretty structured setup that they had, and I think it's something that the schools do pretty well. It's also not something that I had heard about before I started to actively look into MBA programs. It's something that really made the journey very easy. I had already worked for around close to 4.5 years before I left for the MBA. And the currency, because the school does expect you to put down at least, like, if I remember correctly, it's been a while, 15 to 20% of what's required as kind of the overall fees. So
I
you
see.
do need to have that amount locked now. And the currency movements definitely don't help because the payments have to be made in dollars. I absolutely hear you on that.
Yeah, my parents used to tell me when I was traveling not to think too much about currency conversion because it'll prevent you from doing too much, especially if you're in Europe or the States. Because when you
Yeah.
think in rupees, everything is unbelievably expensive when it's actually just the amount it costs.
Yeah.
Um,
So, yeah, I think definitely when I was working for the World Bank, I also used to travel to the US quite a bit for work, specifically Washington, D.C. And I had an Amex card that the company had provided, right? And absolutely hear you. You could be somebody who is earning, pretty decently by Indian standards. But when you're traveling abroad, the currency conversion from rupee to anything else always is it's not something that you want to do, right?
this is true. It's definitely not something that we want to
Yeah.
think about when we're traveling.
Yeah.
Moving on to your work life, you've lived in the UAE and India and traveled all across the Middle East for work. How did you make the decision to move to the UAE from the US? I'm sure it wasn't a very popular decision then, even though it might seem like a possibly visionary one now, because the US seems like the emigration mecca. So, what considerations led you to it?
So it's been almost 9 years now. So I think for me there were a few factors, right? Definitely when I moved to the US, I moved with the goal of probably living there like many people. But then one of the things that was a big decider for me was the fact that it felt really far from everything else. So I wanted to be in a place that felt a bit more like central and closer to India because I have family ties back in India. And I think Dubai turned out to be a choice which sort of met a few different metrics that I had, right? So obviously I had this loan that I had taken for the MBA, which I wanted to pay off as fast as I could. And this is a geography where, if you look at pay scales, it's probably one of the closest to what you will see in the US as well. And there is no taxes. Obviously, a big draw. And the other big factor was kind of the personal factors around travel, for example. I'm a very big travel buff. So, one of the things I wanted to continue doing after my MBA was also travel. So, excluding the COVID years, I had been to around like 40, 50 countries or so, right? So, a place like Dubai allows you to do that. It's probably a direct flight from here. So,
Right.
that's something that I absolutely love about the city. And yeah, so for me, to summarize, it was a combination of very personal factors, which is kind of being in the middle of the world, being in a place that gives me access to travel and a lifestyle which met the bar in terms of what I wanted, and also very practical reasons like no
Mm.
taxes, right?
Ah, that's a good one. That's a very good pull for anyone to live anywhere.
Yeah.
And I remember Dubai it's the stop off point for every time I go west to see either my mom or my sister. So it's halfway between
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
west and the east.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that you'd be there so you can have access to places without
Yeah.
horribly long flight times, I would imagine.
Yeah. So it's and even so for example, my sister lives in Montreal, right? There's a direct
Right.
flight from here. It's a long flight, but there's a direct flight.
It's direct.
Or
Nice.
I went for someone's wedding to Sicily, right? There's a direct flight to Sicily. So it's pretty cool that you can travel to pretty much anywhere in any part of the world with one flight. And it's also very easy to travel. The airlines are great, the airports are great, it's very efficient. Everything works very well. So if you have a weekend trip planned to, a different country, you can do it without flight delays, without things getting lost, bags getting lost, all of that,
That's
right?
fantastic. That's
Yeah.
great. I hadn't thought of the logistical side of it like
Yeah.
this. And Dubai, I heard, is building a new airport, which is massive and it's going to have
Yeah.
a huge capacity, right? So that's going to
That's right.
improve it
Yeah.
further.
Yeah. A new airport towards the south side of the city, where there's also therefore a lot of developments coming up as we
Mm,
speak. The airport exists in some fashion. They're gonna, I think, move over the flights to there.
okay.
A large number of the flights that happen now out of the SK, I guess, will eventually get transferred over.
Right. Is it already close to being ready?
So the way I understand it, definitely some commercial flights and some private flights, etc. You are already operational from there, but probably there's plans to expand capacity and bring it up to the level. Right? I'm not aware of the full details, but there is already an airport that exists, but it's probably going to be made bigger and
I see.
transformed into the central one. So I think that is also one of the deliberate strategies that the city had, right? Because it's a geographic advantage that you have, that you are somewhat in the middle of the world. So to be able to use that to your advantage and to actually make it a transit location, but also one where people stop over, right?
Mm,
Since I moved here 9 years or so to now, if you look at the city, it's really grown a lot, right? The number
mm,
of things they've added in terms of if you're a tourist coming here, the number of attractions you have on offer has really, really grown over these years. So they are actually really using the geographic advantage that the city has by building up the right infrastructure and the logistics
mm.
and the things around entertainment elements that make the city then an attractive stopover for people
Yeah.
going from east to west or west to east.
That makes sense. Along those lines, which visa did you need in order to move? And was there anything that you had to specifically take care of to gain access to it to do so?
So when I moved here during my MBA itself, I decided to recruit for consulting. That's what most people do during their
Mm,
MBA, right? In fact, some of them do their internships even in the fields that they want to be full-time
okay.
employed in. In my case, I did an internship in retail in New York, and then decided, as I said, for a bunch of reasons, that I would be moving out of the U.S.
Mm,
to. A different part of the world. So from the US, I recruited for the Dubai office of McKinsey. I got the offer. Then obviously the employer arranged all of the travel visa. So it was a work visa
I see.
and all of the aspects of getting your residency here, your IDs, everything was done through work. At
Mm,
that point of time, everything was supported. And in Dubai, the government is pretty digitized. So all of the processes are very smooth. They happen very fast and in a very
fantastic.
organized way. But I was also shielded from whatever other requirements were there by my employer, thankfully. So that whole process was extremely smooth from all perspectives,
That's
essentially.
great. I'd imagine the bigger the company, the more established the company, the smoother the process because the
Yeah.
government will assign it more credibility,
Yeah.
immediately.
In my case, I also transitioned out of that to what they call a golden visa, right? Which lets you work and stay here without having an employer. And this was part of like the wider set of visa reforms that Dubai did a few years ago. I think during COVID, a lot of these, right? Because it was a deliberate strategy again on their part to attract talent from different parts of the world and also investments. So that then allows you to stay here without actually having to be employed by a specific person, which is what, if you are a foreigner in most countries, unless you are a resident, that's what you need to do. do, right? So they effectively introduced residency programs, which then allowed people like me to stay back and explore starting my own thing.
So the golden visa requirements that specifically worked in your favor, could you mention those?
One of the brackets is for people who are highly educated, have trainings in specific programs or industries that they are looking to attract. And that's the category that I use for staying. If you are employed here in the UAE and you are paid an X amount of money and there's a certain cutoff salary, that's also another route to become a resident here through the golden visa route. There's also the investment routes, which I think a lot of Indians have explored or are exploring and very actively using. It's also a great strategy to retain talent or expense, right? It's similar to what you would call residencies or permanent residencies in other countries. Right? It's Dubai's version of that.
It makes sense. They're filtering the people that have easy access to a long-term life in Dubai.
Yeah, people who are interested and who also benefit the country that they want to build, right? So it's a two-way transaction.
So, what struck you most about the differences in work culture or culture in general of the UAE as compared to the States when you moved to Dubai?
So the US is obviously a very multicultural place, right? I mean, everyone knows of it as the melting pot of many different cultures. But there is something that's predominantly American, right? So there's sports that are very much, US centered, whether it's like basketball or baseball, American football, all of that. So it's multicultural. It has people from all over the world, but there's a very defining, I mean, who've obviously moved and integrated into that society, right? So it has the multicultural aspects, but also a very central defining way of being American. That's at the core of that. I mean, to me, the surprise is that Dubai is actually probably equally multicultural, but in a very different way. So here, as you know, a large share of the population is actually expats, right? So you have, I mean, I always use my McKinsey teams as an example. So McKinsey Dubai office had people from some 60 plus nationalities, right, working.
Right.
So you have people from all over the world, and many of these people have lived in at least 2 to 3 different countries, and they bring their own experiences and they retain what it means to be a bit from that specific place, right? So it's very multicultural in a way where people are from different places, but at the same time they retain their like home identities. One of the things I used to do with my teams in McKinsey is I would always say, okay, does this team have more than one person who's from the same nationality? And often the answer would be so that brings with it very interesting situations for like when you work in teams at your job. There's no clear set norm of this is how you must do something. Even something small like lunch break. Different cultures have different views on lunch breaks, right?
Absolutely.
Some people believe it's a big communal activity for which you need to take the time out versus others who feel that let's just finish lunch, get the work done, and wrap our days earlier. I think it's not something that I knew about Dubai till I actually came and started to work here. I think now people know more about it because Emirates makes it a point also to announce in the flights how many languages the air hostess speak, etc. That's something that I actually enjoy about the place, right? Having friends from very different, different parts of the world who bring their own different cultures, aspects of Dubai that all of us have inculcated within us as well.
Yeah, it's always fun to have friends from multiple cultures.
Yeah.
Keeps the hangouts very interesting. Did you feel like it wasn't as varied as compared to the UAE overall?
It's one of the places where, I mean, at least up until now, immigration was one of the big drivers of also the
Absolutely.
growth of the country, right? So it obviously has people from many different parts of the world, but there's also deeper integration that happens, especially if you're a second generation American or if you're born and raised there. It's very, your identity, obviously parts belong to where you came from or your ancestors came from or your parents came from. But it's also where you integrate a lot more into society, right? That's different from here, for example, where a lot of people stay expats, right, for through their lives. So, and many of them in the previous generations also used to move back to their home country. In that sense, the retention of what nationality or parts of the world you come from, I feel more than let's say in a place like yours.
The Americans do put an emphasis on integrating. They do want it
Yeah.
to maintain the sort of American identity
Yeah.
across all of the groups. That does make sense. I know that there have been like racial tensions in the past, which I feel like maybe Dubai may not have because they seem to be very welcoming of other cultures and keeping that identity, which is, I guess, what fundamentally makes it different.
Yeah. I think it's two very different models of country building, right? So it's also difficult to compare one to the other. So for a lot of people, for example, they might be moving because they want to get a different nationality,
Mm.
which is possible in a place like the US or UK. Versus here, these are more recent changes that are happening, right? Where even the option of becoming a permanent resident or staying on long, the newer changes that are being introduced.
Right.
So I don't want to say one is better than the other. It just really depends on what you're solving and optimizing for. For
Yes.
some people, having a different passport or a different nationality might be something that they're very actively solving for, right? In which case, a place like the US makes sense. But if you're solving for something else, which is proximity to different places, a certain way of living, having that multicultural experience, having friends and people from all over the world, it's something that this place offers.
Right. So you spent a good amount of time traveling within the Middle East,
Yeah.
especially to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, for various work projects. If I had to ask you to describe one thing that struck you as the most unique about each of these places, what would it be?
So I started going to Riyadh maybe now 7 or 8 years ago. It's a city that's been changing at an astounding pace, right? So I have not seen this rate of transformation in any other places I have visited. So if you compare what it was like to go there, let's say 7 years ago to now, it's changed so much in a very positive way. So it's a place where you can actually see the transformation as you travel and experience the country, which is really good to say, and it's moving in a very progressive direction, which is also great to watch. One of the very obvious changes is also you see more and more women in the workforce, which is also as a woman really great to see. Kuwait actually has really good food. Bahrain is very small and very nice, really friendly and great people. UAE obviously is home, but I've also spent time working in Abu Dhabi, which is more like the cultural capital of the country versus say Dubai, which is more touristy spots. I think these are some of the unique aspects, but overall in the region, there's a very rapid pace of transformation and change that's happening where there's obviously a strategy and a plan to diversify away from oil and develop other sectors of the economy, which is something common between, say, Saudi and the UAE. You can see aspects of this transformation in play in work and in real life, right? It's really a good, unique thing to say in the region.
So I would imagine in Saudi that it's become more forward thinking and much more allowing of women to have the same rights as men over the last 7 years.
I think steps have been taken to move in that direction, right? There's quite a few things that still need to happen, but I think that the direction of change is positive, or what
Fantastic.
I would call positive.
I think culturally, the world is becoming a place where it's very difficult to have that sort of antiquated perspective on women and what they can do.
Yeah, yeah. Even from a pure economic perspective, the cost of keeping women out of the labor force is really high, right? If you're just talking about pure numbers in terms of math, right? Like how, if you want to grow an economy, almost 50% of your population is not actively contributing to that. I think that's one of the biggest reasons and advantages, apart from obviously the need for social and cultural upliftment and many other factors. Women contributing to the labor force is an extremely critical thing for any country's growth.
Makes sense. What was the process of getting your documentation and bank accounts, especially when you moved to the UAE?
So a lot of things here are linked to the Emirates idea. The government issues you when you move here and you become a resident of the country. So opening a bank account or getting a lease or any other process that you want to do are linked to that. So that's the first step in the process. In my case, because it was the first done through my employer, it was quite a straightforward process to open a bank account, right? Because it's often linked to your like salary accounts or where you receive the money. If you're doing this for your own business, that's a whole different type of a setup and route.
Right. Moving on to personal finance. When you started working in the US, what was your budgeting like and how has it changed over the years? How has your allocation to investments and savings changed?
The time that I started working, that was in India, obviously, and then I, worked briefly during my MBA in the US, and then I started working again here in the UAE. In the early years, I knew that I wanted to go and study and get a master's degree abroad. So a lot of my savings was geared towards making that investment, that personal investment in education. Once I had done my master's, one big thing that had to happen was like paying off the loan, which I had taken. Once that was done, the perspective again switches to what are the other things that I want to do, while also making sure that I'm investing my money wisely and growing it. One of my philosophies was also that in travel, which helps you grow as an individual, I also view that as an investment because
Right.
I think it's part of the type of person I want to be. I see that also as a personal investment. Obviously, the aspects of growing money does not happen through that sort of investment. You could grow to be a person who makes more money. If you're purely talking about kind of from a financial perspective, one of the things that I wanted to do early on was also buy a house, right? Invest in a house. Dubai is the kind of market where actually buying makes sense now, especially with like the visa regulations having changed. And also it's unlike, let's say, the Indian market where rental yields are typically low. This is a market which has good rental yields. So even from an investment perspective, if you're looking for rental yields or appreciation of the property itself, it's a good market for that. So that's the space that I'm interested in. And it's also in the last 4-5 years from COVID and even past COVID, there's been huge appreciation in property prices here in Dubai across the different parts of the city, largely because of the visa regulation changes and the influx of people coming in from different parts of the world. A space where I would like to continue to invest. The prospects for that look very promising with the structural changes that are happening in the country.
Right.
Then obviously a bit riskier but still somewhat safe is ETFs, mostly US markets, ETFs and also a bit of gold, not actual gold. So those are kind of the things I now have started to diversify into essentially. But still quite low on the risk front, especially also because I am trying an extremely risky venture of like trying to do my own things. So a lot of the investments are centered in more traditional or somewhat low risk fronts, right?
That makes sense. You're guaranteed some degree of growth with gold ETFs.
Yeah.
That makes sense as an investment philosophy now if you're going to be doing your own thing, because no matter how that goes, you'll still have a foundation to.
Yeah. I mean, it's also the thing where you're doing a startup a bit in a later phase compared to folks who might do it directly after, say, your undergrad or master's, right? So you're approaching it also from a slightly different perspective because the things you're solving for in life are also somewhat different. So the base that you have built should help and obviously does help, right?
Right. Do you feel like you're limited by the timeline because it's at a slightly later stage, or do you feel
No,
like,
not at all. You just have to solve for it very differently, right?
okay, what investment products do you invest in? Where in the world do you invest? And what is the allocation distribution like in that respect?
So, large percentage of it is in real estate and other fixed forms of investment here in the UAE, and around 20% of that in different forms in the US markets. And yeah, so that's broadly it. And I think India is a place I would like to, but the currency is always something that's worrying, right? Keeps depreciating every year. So even if the returns are there, let's say in something like real estate where appreciation can be good, the currency devaluation can almost always wipe out the gains.
Exactly. Yeah. It's interesting that you bring that up because that's exactly what Belong is trying to solve for. With the USD based FDs, our founders have realized that NRIs specifically, such as yourself, in the UAE again would have reservations about investing in the rupee because since even when I was about 9 or 10, 55 rupees was worth a dollar,
Yeah.
thereabouts. And so as a kid, I was always like 50 rupees is a dollar. And lately, it just keeps getting worse. I was so shocked at seeing that it's at 88 now,
Okay, is it?
thereabouts.
Yeah. I think it was something around 85 when I last checked, but yeah, it could be 88 as well. So it's not India specific, but it's something where developing market currencies, of course, always have more fluctuations and volatility vis-a-vis the dollar. Right? Once there's a global downturn or a poor situation, you again see that influx, which devalues the currency. Hopefully, it's not a trend that stays forever, but in the last 7-8 years, we still haven't managed to curb the slide. So let's see when that happens. Right?
That's something fairly new that's even become an option because I think that even the government has realized that NRIs probably don't want to invest in the rupee right now. Do you feel like anything specifically might change that pattern or that trend for the rupee?
Currency is a very complex topic, right? So there's so many different things that go into it. I think the reality is the world in itself is currently in a state of flux given the changes that are happening with like trade policy in the US, which is obviously a big determinant of like currency movements and things around
Yes.
that. And also inflation is high, therefore interest rates, for example, in the US is high. And the UAE is a country where the currency is pegged to the dollars. Interest rates here also rose as they rose in the US as the Fed hiked the rates. So many different factors are currently at play in the space of global trade itself that I think it's hard at the moment, especially for developing countries. And hopefully, the growth of the economy and maybe once there's a bit more clarity in where global trade policy is going to land, that will probably help the currency rate quite a bit.
I see.
There's also a question of, and for example, at the World Bank, for the loans for countries used to be denominated in a basket of currencies, right? So you had a basket mix that was a mix of many different currencies. So I think, especially also given the size of US debt and other factors, that could also be a route where the world goes. But at the moment, I really don't have a prediction on how we would go away from the dollar to something else as well, right? That's a question for the world, not just India.
Absolutely. Despite the growth of the economy, which is right now booming, it still continues to depreciate, which is just interesting.
I mean, I think the Indian growth as well, there's a question of kind of how much employment are you adding with that growth? And even now, if you compare us on like per cap, on even purchasing power at parity adjusted terms, right? We are growing, but it's growth from a very low base. So there's significant growth that would be needed for us to even place us as a middle income country, right?
That's largely due to the percentage of the population, right?
Also, because of what is the type of growth you're creating, whether it's ones where jobs are being added at the pace they need to be added at. You can have growth which comes with a lower percentage of job addition versus a growth that's actually one where employment is also growing at a fast pace, right? I haven't spent time recently studying the economy, but that's also one of the bigger drivers. If you look at China, for example, when it was in its early growth phases, the rate at which it was growing on a year per year basis was much higher than the pace at which India is growing, right? That was when they were making the transition from being a low income country to a bit on the higher end of that spectrum. So the pace of growth required to take you from where we are to the next level by itself is quite a bit.
Mm.
And of course, we also have the population challenge. But having observed other countries which have proactively curbed population growth, let's say China, I'm not sure that's also a great strategy.
Yeah, no, it doesn't seem to be. It's kind of overcorrected their growth, putting that policy in
Yeah.
place. So let's move on to your journey of starting your own company and working independently. What is your startup aimed at building, and what's the elevator pitch? I know you're in stealth mode, but
Yeah.
any information would be.
So, since I left consulting, the first thing I did was set up one company through which I do independent advisory work, so strategy advisory work for companies. And that's a way of me funding myself while I figure out the startup and also for before I fundraise for it, etc. Right? So, I experimented with one idea last year. I dropped it and now I'm on my second one. So the one liner is we are building something that makes dating emotionally healthier for people. My co-founder is also my sister, who is actually a psychology PhD and a psychologist. So we are building something that addresses the emotional pain points of dating, which has become an increasingly painful journey for most people across different age groups and spectrums. And this is an app which will have various plans that support people with like emotional well-being through this journey and various components that use psychology but also other things around like meditation, journaling, different ways of self-reflection. And we want to also include features that help people connect people to others who might be going through similar journeys, and at later stages add support through dating, relationship advisors or therapists. So that's where we are in early stages of like product build, and hopefully inshallah in the next 2-3 months we have the product out.
Very exciting. I definitely want to see this when it comes out. I feel like the connotation with a lot of the dating apps that exist now is that it's just sort of time pass and it doesn't really necessarily look out for either party psychologically, emotionally.
I think that whole segment is also one where there's a lot of flux happening. But I think for a lot of people, they're also staying out of it or from dating itself because it's emotionally very exhausting in ways that didn't exist even before, right? You have phenomenon like ghosting and a lot of lack of clarity on where things might be headed, new pain points that have arrived with the dating apps. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
understand Gen Z is also quite wary of it by now. So you can also see this in the trends with a lot of dating apps. So that's the space that is fascinating. And I think we bring very complementary skill sets. One person understands the human mind, the other person understands business.
That sounds good, considering your sister is taking care of the psychological side of it, and that's a primary consideration is really very interesting. I was born in '97, so that's the first year of Gen Z, technically.
Okay.
Don't necessarily feel like it.
Are you a cusp, as they call it?
I would imagine. I feel
Yeah.
like there's a term for people on the cusp who feel like millennials.
But I think the key tiebreaker is, do you wear long socks or short socks?
I wear long socks. I have
Okay.
minions on my socks
You're
right
Gen
now.
Z.
Really? Seriously?
Yeah.
That's a good one because my sister is 10 years older than me and she wears ankle socks all the time.
That's right. This is the deciding question. If you want to, don't look at a person's face, look at the socks.
That's great. That's decisive and it's revealing. I have minions on my socks right now from Despicable Me and they're long.
Yeah.
So I guess that proves it. But it's already gotten to a point where there's like a serious percentage of my friends and even some family members who've covertly met people that they ended up loving on Bumble, Hinge, and because our parents are in a different generation,
Yeah.
no one wants to say that. So they'll come up with some cover for the story, but it's such a shame they have to do that because it's like someone you're in love with. But it's interesting that there's a serious percentage of people where they've already met their match on an app. And for me, when I met the person I'm with currently and we have serious plans, in my head, it's something nice that we didn't meet on an app and that there's a story of spontaneity and everything. But maybe that's an antiquated way of looking at it. And things are changing because the world is just so different now.
Yeah. I think the code word apparently in India is somebody introduced us. If you met on an app, I actually met my partner through someone mutual. I was told that that's the code word for we met on an app. We actually did. Then we had to show the person a proof. But anyway, jokes aside, I think the dating apps are now a predominant way in which people meet, and there's plenty of them out there. Right? It's just how do you make that journey a bit smoother for people emotionally?
Yeah.
And especially if you've not had a lot of success on the apps, then it becomes one where there's rejection is something that you have to deal with.
Yeah.
Which psychologically is something you just need to prepare yourself and learn how to do. Because I think we all know that not everyone's going to like everyone, right? It's
Of
just a
course.
question of how do you prepare yourself psychologically so that when you go through the process, it doesn't hit you as hard.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it. And I think that an angle that people don't often think about. In India, there's something to do with how the percentages are skewed, where if you are a woman, people get a ton of matches.
Yeah, yeah,
Huge percentage of guys don't get any.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
that psychologically must be pretty heavy to deal with, I would imagine.
Yeah. This is actually factually true. It's not just in India, it's all over the world. So the
Right.
dating apps have an algorithm. Many of them employ some type of an algorithm for ranking profiles. And there's also a behavioral difference between how men and women operate on dating apps, right? So women on average, they tend to swipe left more than they swipe right. Men, on the other hand, swipe right on everyone and then once at the conversation phase, decide actually what they want to do.
Hilarious.
And therefore, I think the app has a clear way of ranking men's profiles because they actually make more deliberate decisions. So, therefore, with guys, the profiles are ranked more clearly. And if you're not in the top percentage profiles in terms of swipes and whatever the algorithm has taken into account for the ranking, you're less likely to get matches. And as you said, it's got a huge damaging effect and a lot of men. I've spoken with people in different age brackets, all the way from like 23 to 36. It's quite emotionally damaging if you're on the app. and you only get like for 2 matches and you see women getting, I don't know, 500, right? So,
Yeah.
so it's a real thing that's built into how the apps work and aided by the difference in behavior between men and women. It's a very real thing. And I think it's something that will not happen in real life, because in real life, because you're meeting people face to face, there's some sort of, I think, automatic adjustment and selection process that happens. Yes. Versus when you're on the app, all you see is the pictures and what they've written. So also you're suddenly swiping on people who you might not have been interested in real life,
Right.
or the other way around, right?
Yeah.
Charm, things like personal elements are simply not something that you can capture through these. So it
Yeah.
presents different problems. So then the question is also, how do you prepare a person for that? And then there are apps like Hinge that are doing well versus some of the others like Bumble, etc., have seen a stagnation in the growth. I think the fundamental thing of rejection and also quite a bit of like loneliness as you go through the journey. If you're
Mm.
doing a lot of dating in social context, it's also less lonely in some way because you'll have friends who know them or friends who know, the other person. So it becomes more socially okay
Right.
to do the conversations versus on a dating app, if you met someone, it could be someone who disappears from your life completely in a matter of weeks. So there's less permission to discuss that as well from a
Mm.
psychological perspective. So how do you
Yes.
make that journey also a bit less lonely?
That's amazing. That's amazing that you guys are working to figure that out because you're right. You can't figure as much personality or charm into an app, although certain apps are trying to do it. I know they're trying to do it with prompts and
Yeah.
voice notes and other things and maybe try and add personality. But the vast majority of the impression I would imagine it makes when people see a profile is the pictures. That's interesting. I'm gonna try and not go down the rabbit hole of that because it's personally fascinating. But
Yeah.
I'm excited to see this app when it comes. So, how did you decide that you want to leave your career at McKinsey to start up, and what was the primary motivation, do you think?
So when I was in business school already, I was exploring and brainstorming different startup ideas, but I guess I didn't have the risk profile to go after it right then. So it was something that had always been on my mind. And McKinsey, in all honesty, I really liked my colleagues. I enjoyed the type of work. So I stayed on for a few years and I became associate partner. I was very close to making partner. Then you are actually a full-fledged consultant. A lot of people even leave before that as like once they make manager, etc.
Mm.
So I had reached that point where it was almost like now or never sort of stage in my own head. There's no such thing again. And I left with 2 or 3 ideas or areas that I was passionate about. And one of the things that I was clear about was whatever I'm working on, it should be topics and things that really interest me and intellectually fascinate me, where I wouldn't mind spending the time to actually think about it, right? Which
Right.
might not be a very practical way to approach this because a lot of people think about what ideas are like at the cutting edge of investment right now, which probably is also a practical, smart way to go about it. But for me, this was very clear. It was something that was always on my mind. And I think at that juncture, I said, either you do this now or you're not going to do this. So this is the time to leave and figure this out. And at McKinsey, I was actually working with clients, bigger corporate clients and others who wanted to build out digital products of their own or were exploring adjacent value propositions to their offerings in the digital space, right? So I got started to get exposure to digital business builds and things around that, which also prepared me a bit to step into this journey. It was a question of also finding the right co-founder. So in the last year or so, I was predominantly focused on doing my own advisory work and exploring ideas. And it's in the last 3, 4 months or so that my sister and I have decided to work together and taken very concrete steps towards that.
Great.
Obviously, it's very different, and it's a very I think everyone would say it's a scary journey, right? Because the odds of success, as we all know, are like very low. To go and do something like this, that also comes with its own, I guess, good parts and disadvantages. But so far, so good. Let's see how it goes. Yeah.
I think it's going to be good. You seem very measured because you had the fail safe of having consulting on the side.
That's right. Which is in some ways good and in some ways maybe not so good, right? Because there's always the option of funding my way through a year doing those projects and exploring. But now I think I have closed that door off to myself a little bit to also just
I see.
create pressure to speed up and get to the launch stage. And I think having a co-founder on board and someone we work actually really well together is also a very big kind of accountability factor, and it's just very different since we started to build this together, right? There's the push and the self-imposed pressure to kind of move forward and move forward fast is a lot more than before, and I think it's really, really needed.
I'm sure because someone's watching your progress now,
Yeah.
even if it is a family member, so you feel accountable.
Yeah.
That's great. What is it like working with family?
So my sister would explain this in psychology terms. Apparently, siblings have very complementary skill sets. Also, by virtue of the fact that you're siblings and you've had to deal with, I guess, parents in different ways with different approaches. So it's been really good, really, really good. She's brilliant at what she does. She understands. I mean, she's done quite a lot. She has extensive research background in the field of like cognitive decision making, cognitive psychology, etc. So, and we have very complementary skills. So she's a very detail oriented person, and I am a very big picture vision oriented person. So I think we really do have very complementary skills, and it's been quite an enjoyable journey.
That's fantastic. So she said that overall siblings tend to have complementary skill sets.
Somewhat, apparently, it's. I mean, it could also not be the case, whether you are oldest or the youngest.
Yes.
These kind of factors also go into deciding. And I think naturally also we either want to excel at something slightly different. Those kind of variances play into apparently how you operate. I don't know if it's can be
Wow.
broadly
Interesting.
generalized, but yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, interesting.
So, can you describe the process of setting up a company in strategy advisory consulting?
Yeah.
What were the other options in front of you when you began and potential trade-offs?
Yeah. So in the UAE, I think if you want to set up something, there's a clear division between what's considered mainland and what's considered free zones, right?
Right.
The free zones are the areas where, from a legal perspective and all sorts of like administrative perspective, it's much easier to set up companies like Media City or like the Dubai International Financial Center, which is there are many different options that exist both here in Dubai or like even Abu Dhabi, Ras Al Khaimah, etc. And the cost and the setup costs, etc., vary based on which free zone you want to go to, and whether that free zone permits the specific business activity that you're going to be engaged in, right? So for me, the process was identifying the different free zones where strategy, advisory, and consulting as an activity is approved or allowed, and purely making, because I did not also need a visa to stay here. It was simply about optimizing costs from a setup perspective, and the business license fees are also something that you pay annually. So just working with company that supports on the setup process, identifying a right zone and getting that set up. And then for the company bank account as well, I use one of the digital banks called Wire Bank, which also had a very smooth process once you have your company license and ID documents in place, right? So it's often boils down to choice of which free zone or like which zone do you want to set up your activity in. There are some other activities for which you need to be in the mainland, which have more complex processes, but mine is set up in a free zone, and that's probably the best route to explore for a majority of kind of service-related activities, right?
I see. So, what would you say was the most confusing part of setting up the company and operations in the UAE, and how did you figure it out or circumvent it?
So I think the confusing part is obviously the difference between the requirements of, let's say, mainland versus free zones, right? That's a sort of a very specific concept that exists here, because also they want to create specific legal environments, right? And where you need a local partner, all of those sort of aspects as well. So figuring out the free zone and which free zone was somewhat complex, but in all honesty, I don't think it's a super complicated process at all, because the steps move fairly fast. And once you've figured out where it is that you want to set up, it's a fairly straightforward processes actually that exist. Right?
Can you tell us some of the unique disadvantages and advantages you think you have starting up as an NRI in a foreign country, so to speak?
Yeah. I think I'm starting in a place. I mean, I started in a place where I had lived already for around 6, 7 years or so, right? So
Mhm.
I'm really familiar with the place. So you don't feel like you're suddenly landing in a new country and trying to set up, right? So for me, I would say if I had to set up something, say in the U.S. or here or someplace or India, which are markets that I'm familiar with, it's always different from going to an entirely new place and trying to set shop because you just know a lot of the aspects of how things administratively work. How is it culturally? How is it to so those sort of aspects are relatively straightforward if you have exposure to the place already. I think disadvantage wise, to be honest, so far I haven't felt anything because from a residency and all of those perspectives, it's already in place. And
Mm,
yeah, I mean, so far so good, right? It's they actually here again they're trying to make business setup and all of those things smooth and easy, and I
right.
guess I am benefiting from that, right? Again, as you say, inshallah, if it does well, then it's gonna look very good. Otherwise, we'll still figure it out.
Absolutely. I'm sure the doors will still be open with consulting and other
Yeah,
work that you've done in the past.
yeah, we'll see.
I feel like having a fail-safe with something and not having it works differently for different people depending on their psychology. Like, for example, when I was doing music, because I had no other fail-safe when I was younger, it was often fairly stressful considering prospects because it puts immense pressure on you, which is a good thing. It makes some people driven, it drives other people into some sort of anxiety. It really depends. But that's interesting that you've started moving away from having some sort of protection so that
Yeah,
potentially it pushes further for your idea.
yeah, yeah.
That's
Yeah,
solid.
I think a fail safe, depending on your risk profile, can go either ways, right? Yeah.
Moving on to the rapid fire section. First question: where do you feel the greatest sense of belonging?
Sense of belonging. I don't have a specific place like that.
Mm, right.
I guess the greatest sense of belonging is with people I love, right? Essentially. That can be in any country or any part of the world.
Describe home in one sentence.
Home in one sentence. Again, where friends and family are, yeah, that's
Mhm.
home, wherever there is.
What is the one thing that you take from each country you've lived in to build an ideal place?
Vast generalization, but from I think Europe, a sense of balance between life and fun and all of those aspects. Then from Indian culture, the interest in intellectual pursuits. From let's say the US, the idea of like how to present yourself and deeper questions of who you are. Things around that. Here in the Dubai, the sense of being from everywhere and still having roots here.
Pick a winner for the following between Delhi, Philadelphia, and Dubai. Food.
Food, kebabs, Delhi kebabs.
Nice.
Philly has its own famous Philly cheesesteak, but I think the other thing that people don't know about Philly is that it's also starting point for a lot of restaurants before they go to New York. So it also has a lot of good food spots. Dubai, Muhammara. Yeah, so the best, Lebanese and Levant foods.
Right. But out of the three, which one do you think is the best?
I think Dubai.
Nice. Okay. Same rules apply. Out of the three, which one do you think is the best? 50.
Definitely Dubai. I
That's
think
what I
it's
think.
one of the, probably Singapore also comes close. It's one of the cities where, especially as a woman, you can be out anytime without being worried about your safety. And that's kind of a big ask, right? For
Mm.
women still in most parts of the world.
Unfortunately.
Yeah,
Um,
unfortunately.
yeah. So ease of making friends between these three places.
Ease of making friends, probably Delhi. I think India is a very friendly place, right? We're also a very communal society, so it's very easy, even if you're from outside. And there's a culture of like honoring guests and being hospitable. So I think it's the easiest place to actually. But then you would have to ask this question to a foreigner to understand the other side. But for me, definitely India.
No, I've heard this from a few people, actually. The one thing that I've heard common between a lot of different people, different cultures who talk about the best things about India is the food and the communal culture. It's easy to sort of be let in here, which is nice.
Absolutely.
Something to be proud of.
I think it's beneficial, very beneficial, right? Because I think the sense of loneliness is also a lot lower, right? Because of that,
Oh yeah.
versus in different parts here, and I think the West as well, people struggle, and it's almost an epidemic that's catching up in different ways. But I think in
Mm.
India, the communal factor really helps with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just can't wrap my head around it as an Indian, why people in the West would feel lonely. I mean, I don't see the deep experience of what it's like living there because I've only spent little bursts of time in England, Germany,
Yeah, because
where
yeah, I think the communal aspect of Indian culture means that, wherever you are, and then also by virtue of the fact there's so many of us, right?
yeah,
You don't have moments where, or like places or large stretches of time where you are just by yourself, right?
right.
And I think in other cultures which are more individualistic and where there's lower concentration of people, just from the physical, number of people perspective, it's a lot more perceptible, right? Like you can definitely feel that difference. Yeah.
I see what you mean. Yeah. I've really heard that it is an epidemic though, and that people find it difficult. It's interesting that the West seems to have so much better infrastructure, but it seems to be lacking for people who are struggling with loneliness somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's different social constructs that are placed, right? I mean, and again, it's the trade-off between individual focused societies and communal societies, right? I mean, in India, I think our equivalent struggle is for establishing individuality because there's obviously quite a lot of set norms on how you operate in this kind of a setup. A lot of I guess millennial Gen Z struggles are around establishing, especially if you want to do something different.
Yeah.
I guess in more Western cultures, there's less resistance for that because the expectation is that you do what you want to do. But the trade-off is that then you also have to figure that out more on your own and with less support from the
That's
community.
so interesting. I've never seen that parallel drawn. That's so true. Yeah. So again, winner from the following between Delhi and Philly and Dubai, public transport.
Oh, I think all three of them are not that great. Yeah, so I mean, this one's a hard pick. So one of the things about me is that in any place that I've lived in, I have somehow managed to live without taking a lot of public transport
Really?
or driving.
What?
Right.
What driving? How's that possible?
Yeah, I think I would not have survived it so well in the pre-Uber, pre-Kareem, which is our equivalent here, era. And yeah, and these are all of these are actually somewhat driving cities as well, right? I have lived in
That's what I've
all of
heard.
them without a car.
Wow.
Without using public transport for the most part. So
Oh,
that's just
nice.
a me thing. It's not a city thing.
Nice. So it's just Uber?
Yeah, Uber, I mean, the equivalent of that, one of the big players here is Kareem. So I take Kareem's.
Nice.
And yeah, and Filia cabs, Ubers, Delhi as well for the most part.
That's
Somehow.
great. I've heard
Autos, cars, yeah.
nice. I feel
Yeah.
like the Ubers in Dubai are very, very nice.
Yeah, we have some really fancy cars.
Okay. So last pick between the three. Things to do on the weekend.
I love beaches, so beach
Nice.
here in good weather. The only thing is the summer is really harsh. So if you ask me, I mean, right now the beach is not such a great option, but
Okay.
straightforward pick beach, love beaches. So yeah,
That's
beaches
great. I
here.
feel
And
like
also the other Emirates actually have some even more beautiful beaches. So like Abu
really.
Dhabi and Ras Al Khaimah.
That's amazing. I feel like the overall winner is Dubai from all of
Yeah,
these.
which is where I am now. But this could again change. We don't know. Yeah.
Life's an adventure. That's great though. They've really managed to turn it into a place that is winning on so many fronts. It's really fascinating.
So I describe it as a teenage city, right? It's in its very early growth years and doing quite well in that growth spurt. Because if you compare it to, say, a city like Philadelphia or Delhi or any of the other places, right? I mean, even Singapore by now, right? They all have had much longer stretches of, you know, times of growth. And I mean, for a place like, let's say, Philadelphia in the US, it's been around forever. So this is a city in its like teenage years. And I think the teenager is like, the growth is in the right direction and the spurts of growth are great. So yeah, it's good to be here and to see that and be part of it. But I also think of myself as a global person. So I don't, as long as family and friends are around, very comfortable living in other parts of the world as well.
Fantastic. That is evident. Well, thank you very much, Maria. That's been episode 8 of Everywhere We Belong, and it's been a very informative one, if I might say, and entertaining.
Thank you very much for having me, Mika. It was a pleasure chatting and look forward to more conversation in the future.
Of course, and I'm excited to see your trajectory as well,
Yeah.
especially with the
And
application.
all the best to Belong as well as you guys.
Thank you. It's going to be good.